Well, I just want to say thank you to some of my coworkers. I'm Ryan Schaub, and I work in the Frontier Extension District. I had some behind the scenes help from an office professional of ours, Madison Moyer, and then Darren Hibden and Rod Schaub, two of the other ag agents in our district. They have been helping me out as well. So I do want to say thank you to them. But I'd also like to thank you guys as well. Sean and Lyle Turner will be our speakers this evening. They're from Turner Flowers and Country Store, located in Ottawa. So with that, Sean, I'll let you go ahead. And I will say it might be easier if we all mute ourselves, just so we don't have any interruptions. And then we'll if you have questions, you can send them in the chat, or at the end of the meeting, we can get started there as well. So, all righty. Thank you, Sean. Lyle?
Thanks, Ryan. Well, as Ryan said, I'm Sean Turner. This is my dad, Lyle Turner, and the two of us, along with my mom, his wife, Kathy, are the three owners of Turner Flowers downtown. We've been in the greenhouse and flower business for a long, long time. Grandpa started the greenhouse out on the farm in 1936 and had a greenhouse and diversified agriculture production going out there. Dad expanded that greenhouse in the mid 70s to about a half an acre. And that's what I grew up in out there on the family farm, was with a half-acre greenhouse. He also had a flower shop at 8th and Hickory that was the former Osborne greenhouse. And so when I was a kid, he'd be working on a family wedding on the dining room table, and I thought that's how everybody's dad did it. And I found out later on that wasn't necessarily the case. But we've been here in this location since 2006. I'm the head designer and have a design team that works under me. Mom takes care of the books and the business office part, and then Dad manages the farm. And we have a small greenhouse out there now that we do some various crops and propagate about 30 different varieties of succulents. Anything else you'd say introduction wise?
No, I was in the extension. I was an extension agent 47 years ago is when I started. So I have a little bit of knowledge of what you're going through right now.
And it always, I know in extension, it's always been a challenge to organize meetings and get people there for them. And the COVID situation has made that even more exciting. So how fantastic that we've got platforms like this to make it happen. So we've got four main facets that we want to touch on this evening. First one, I want to talk a little bit about vegetable gardening. Everybody always asks us questions about seed starting in the house and what crops are better to direct seed, how to prepare and amend our soil, when to plant different things. We want to touch on that a little bit. Then move into flower gardening, a little bit about outdoor container gardens and flower beds, potting media, using soil versus a soilless media, placement and watering care. Third thing we get a lot of questions about is houseplants. When to transplant, how to transplant, when not to transplant. A lot about watering and fertilizing. Then we've had some questions too about how COVID and global pandemic has affected the horticulture industry. And we've seen some ongoing effects with that. And so we'll share some snippets about that as well. And then we're excited to see what questions you all have at the end. So I'll let Dad start off with the vegetable piece.
I started vegetable gardening today. I direct seeded right in the greenhouse in flats on tomatoes and peppers and a few oddball seeds that I'm going to start inside. If you're starting them in the house, you might not want to start them this early. They tend to get a little leggy unless you get some lights set up or a good window or something like that to put them in. But it's time to get a few of the vegetable seeds started now. I even start my potatoes and onions in flats and then transfer them to the garden when it gets a little better weather. But that's just the way I do it. A lot of people may prefer to direct sow right in the garden. And if you've got her all worked up and done your fall plowing and got a good rain, maybe you're ready to go now.
So what are some things that you do go ahead and direct seed?
Well, you could certainly go in with spinach and your onion sets, your onion plants, whatever you might have on hand. If you are going to put some asparagus roots in, now would be a fine time to do that. There's a lot of cool crops that you can go in with. Even you don't think about it, but beets and peas especially can be put in now.
And some soil amendment things. Some people really like to use manure. Make sure if you're using manure, especially if it's a horse manure or rabbit manure, that it's something that's been allowed to sit. If it's fresh horse or rabbit manure, it's going to be way too hot. That's something that needs to really sit in compost for about a year. If you're using, cow manure or something like that, it doesn't need to sit near as long. But that horse manure sure is hot. If you've got a friend that's got horses and they offer you free compost, make sure you know how long it's been sitting there before you pile it right on the garden, because you might be burnt right out of a crop.
A lot more nitrogen than is necessary.
A whole bunch more nitrogen than is necessary, for sure. Fertilizer wise, we a lot of times use a liquid fertilizer, just a regular uniform blend. There's a lot of conversation about whether you want to keep those numbers even, or if you want to drop that middle number, especially with houseplants and the bedding plants. To 3 numbers of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. A lot of the modern studies are showing to drop that phosphorus in half, and it keeps your bedding plants and some of your vegetable plants from getting quite as tall and leggy. So some of those things I like to go with more of a 20-10-20. But it's always safe to go with a uniform blend just right across the field.
I'm old school. I still go for the 20-20-20. I usually don't vary that potassium down with a good rounding number there. Your 20-20-20 and a soluble plant food. It could be like whatever you can find that's soluble, that'll go right in water in a 20-20-20 basis. Can't think of right now what we're using, but
well, Schultz is what we're using at the moment. That we get in a big 4 or 5 pound green and white box that they have at Menards, and we found that per pound it's about as affordable as anything, and is a nice uniform blend.
It's also something with about 2 or 3 tablespoons per 2 gallons. You can put that right over your plants. You don't have to worry about burning them, and right over the top.
Yeah, for sure.
Sean,
Yes, sir.
we had a question. How useful are worm castings?
It takes a lot of them to be the equivalent of using a regular soluble fertilizer.
It's a very low concentration. It would be like your organic fertilizers. Any of them may be 1 or 2% or 0.5%. When we're thinking 20% on a fertilizer that we would put in directly. There's nothing wrong with them. They're fine. It just takes a lot of perseverance and adding quite a bit of it to your garden.
Worm castings are something that I would classify right in there with fish emulsions. It's something that it just takes an awful lot of it to get enough to make the same response with your plants. Historically, I'm not a huge proponent as far as saying got to be organic. One difference, though, that I would promote, we did a hydroponic lettuce study when I was up at K-State, and we had 2 different hydroponic fields set up, one that was conventional fertilizer and one that was set up with worm castings and fish emulsions. And I was surprised that there was a difference in the flavor of the lettuce between the 2. The conventionally produced hydroponic lettuce was a lot more bitter, and the one that was organic that used the fish emulsions and the worm castings was a lot smoother and a lot sweeter and a little bit more tender.
Especially if you don't wash it.
Well, that's true. You get that nice fishy flavor in there too.
Earthy tones.
Earthy tones. That's it. Yeah. Always rinse your vegetables, folks. Always.
And that's bought in once in
yeah, for sure.
Even if they're bagged and say they're washed.
That was the only instance, was that one study that I noticed a difference in the flavor out in the soil and in the garden. I think there's enough factors with the minerals in the soil and things like that that go into flavor. You're not going to notice a difference on flavor, but you are going to need a lot more of it in order to see a response with a worm casting or a fish emulsion.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, great question. So it might go ahead and roll into the flower gardening side, unless there's anything else you were going to mention
Sure,
on vegetables.
you do that.
Okay, so we get a lot of questions in here about outdoor gardens and flower beds and potting media. I know we've got some folks on the call tonight that have got as much or more experience with cut flower gardening out in the field as I do. Some things that we've done in the last few years is we've done some sunflower gardening out in the field. One year we even did 6 acres. Just ran them through corn plates on a 2-row planter right into the field. When you're doing flower gardening, you got to think about what your purpose is. Are you wanting something that's going to be just really pretty to have at your home or along the road for people to see, or is this something that you're wanting to harvest as a cut flower? And that was one thing that we realized after we'd planted that 6 acres of sunflowers, is they were absolutely gorgeous, but there was no way on God's green earth for us to use that many of them at one time. And so we wished we had staggered the planting just a little bit so that we had them coming into bloom at different times. And in a field situation, we found it was no different than caring for corn. We were, running a cultivator through the field and checking for insects and checking for weeds and just kind of letting the sunflowers do their own thing. And it's a little different than doing a small flower bed at home or a small container garden. I do a large zinnia bed outside of my house most years. It's about 400 square feet, 8 by 50, something like that. I've tried a lot of different methods. I've tried rows. I've tried just mass plantings that they get broadcast in. I've tried tying them up. I've tried letting them do their own thing. And at the end of the day, you're going to have a pretty flower bed either way. As far as for my flower bed, I think just broadcast planting is about as pretty as anything, and they support each other and get nice and tall. And since it's a long, narrow bed, I can reach in and cut without really needing rows. I found when I did rows and I tried to keep some clean soil or some mulched area in between, it was just almost disheartening to try to keep up with weeds on a large flower bed like that. I would just as soon have them in more of a broadcast planting and let them do some of their own weed control.
We have got a little advantage on some people. We've been truck gardening for many years, 15 acres or so. So when somebody thinks about planting a few tomatoes or something, we might have at one time planted 6,000 or 7,000 of one thing. But so we have a little experience in almost all vegetable crops and a great many flower crops.
I grew up listening to him say, if it's worth doing at least 100. And for the most part, if you were going to put a vegetable or a plant out in the field, you weren't going to do it unless you had at least 100 of them. And then, you have people say, well, I need 2 tomato plants. It's like, well, if it's worth doing 2, go ahead and do the other 98. Just finish the job. And then get you a booth down at the Ottawa Farmers Market, and you'll be in great shape.
As he grew up in my greenhouse, I grew up in my dad's greenhouse. And at that time, people really gardened. I mean, people put out family gardens. They put out like 400 sweet potato plants. Didn't think a thing about it every year for a large family. And tomato plants, they'd never put out less than 100 or so. And now we're in an all
they were going to can them too.
Oh, you bet. They would preserve them. But we're in a different situation now, and people buying plants 1 and 2 and a half a dozen at most, and maybe a dozen sometimes. But it's a different world now.
And so many of our customers don't want just a baby tomato plant anymore. They would rather have something in a 1 or 2 gallon pot that's within a week or 2 of blooming and producing fruit too. And that's a big paradigm shift over decades of time.
Well, we're into this instant gratification sort of thing.
Well, that's true. That's true. On all the pieces, a society outside of gardening, from technology to media to anything, has kind of bred that, I think. One thing I would say on container gardening, some things to think about: making sure that you've got good drainage, making sure based on what you're going to plant where you put that container, thinking about the amount of light it's going to get, how accessible it is to water. Is it somewhere that you're going to see it every day as you walk in and out of the house, or is it somewhere that you're likely to ignore it? Because if it's somewhere that it's close and accessible, you're going to take better care of it. It's going to look a lot better. And soil amendment. There's a lot of conversations about what type of soil to put in those. And my biggest bane is the pre-made soil mixes that you can get from your big box stores. And when you do a little bit of research, you find that those pre-made soil mixes that have a little bit of everything in them, a lot of times come from scrapings of sewage treatment plants. And sure, it's kind of the same stuff as using cow manure, but I feel a lot better about running my hands through cow manure than I do something that was scraped off the bottom of a sewage treatment plant.
One thing we run into on these boughten soil mixes, there are
Pulverized.
no standards.
No standards.
And one of the cheap things, well, whatever's cheap is what they put the most of in, kind of like cereal and everything else, I guess. But if black peat moss, the powdered black peat moss is
in a compressed bale.
what they can find that is cheap, that's what they'll put in. And
Yeah.
black peat is the very worst thing you can get in a soil mix. Now, if you go with the red sphagnum moss that comes in a compressed bale, that's excellent stuff. And I have used it in the greenhouse for, better than 40 years as my main soil for anything from cactus to hanging baskets to vegetable plants. And that is 2/3 of your red peat moss and 1/3 sand. And that's what I've used for years and years. Then using the 20-20-20 mix, it'll come out about right, and you will have a lot less disease problems, insect problems, and that sort of thing.
And peat moss with sand is considered a soilless potting media. You're not using any dirt, you're not using any compost or manure. But the beautiful thing about peat moss is it does a really good job at holding some moisture. It does a really good job at holding and distributing nutrients to plants. It has a really high level of organic matter that distributes nutrients to the plants. And when you get it in those compressed bales, it is sterile. You don't have a lot of weed seeds in it. And that's the downside with getting a pickup load of manure from your local rancher is whatever that cow has been eating that's got seeds in it, those seeds pass right through. And every seed that's in your container is a weed that you're going to be pulling later. So I'd much rather be starting with a sterile and clean soil media that I'm not going to have weeds coming up before my marigolds take hold.
I like to use it as a wet mix. I use an old cement mixer, and I throw my peat moss and my sand in and just let it mix, throw some water in, get it good and moist, and that makes a perfect seed bed for your containers or whatever you want to use it for, or amend your flower beds.
Yeah, you can get a compressed bale of peat moss and spread it right over your regular flower garden and mix it in with your tiller or a hoe. And that's a really nice way to amend your soil to get some natural nutrients in there, increase the organic matter, increase the water holding of that garden space. Very handily.
They're about $8 for a compressed bale, like a two foot at Menards or some of the other box stores. But then you see the bag of prepared soil that you don't know what is in it, maybe $15, $18 for one bag. And
the big ones, yeah.
Actually, it's a cheaper way to go with just the peat moss.
A compressed bale goes a lot further. And we've even just used the playground sand in a pinch, but you can take 5-gallon buckets out to Bones Rock Yard there on the north side of town and buy sand by the bucket and be able to set a 5-gallon bucket of sand in the back of your car or truck, take it home. And for most household gardeners that are going to do a few hanging baskets and a few container gardens around their home, 1 or 2 compressed bales and a 5-gallon bucket or 2 of sand is going to take care of you for the entire season. Very inexpensively, I might add.
Something else about the peat moss, would it hold up in a container gardening to repetitive waterings? I mean, you use compost or something like that, it's going to compress or compact a little bit. This is going to hold up better, I would assume.
Pore space is much better with the peat moss, the air pore space. And one thing that most people fail to remember is that it's just as important for the roots of your plants to have access to air as it is for them to have access to water. They need a 50-50 balance of exposure to air and exposure to water. And using that peat moss does help your pore space. If you like something like perlite or vermiculite to stir in there as well, but that's what the sand does too, in with the peat moss, is it helps increase that air pore space so that your roots find the soil breathable.
The problem with perlite, it floats out a lot of the time. It just doesn't stay in your mix.
And sand's not going to float.
No, and vermiculite is expensive. Vermiculite's a very good additive. Haydite was one that we used to use, and that was a Buildex product that was calcined clay, but it's not available for the most part to individuals.
Yeah. And there was, I remember we had a doctoral student at K-State from Africa when I was at K-State in the horticulture department. Her name was Rose Ogutu, and she knew that they were really, they had a society that was food deprived, and they knew that they needed to increase their production of their vegetables and their food, but they didn't have access to a lot of really good soil medias or soilless potting medias. And so she was doing a study with pelletized calcined clay to see if they could mix that in with other soil media types to create a blend that would allow them to affordably grow a good food source in her home village that didn't require trucking in a lot of expensive amendments or as many.
Now, like you might say, wait a minute, that red peat moss is acid. We use it on our blueberries. We use it on our acid-loving plants. Well, that's true, but we have a unique situation here that our water is quite alkaline. So it all balances out with the slightly acid peat moss, your alkaline water, and I have had no problems over the years.
We have so much limestone in our soil here that it brings that acid level down to a base, and the peat balances it nicely.
That said, somebody's going to say magnesium sulfate or what's the crystals?
Oh yeah, water softener type crystals.
Well, anything like that. We don't really need magnesium sulfate right here. Our soils are basically high in magnesium. Gypsum salts is what I was trying to think of.
Oh yeah.
And if you're going to use gypsum salts, if I put it in a tub and soak your feet after you garden, that's your best use for
it. And you probably need it if you're doing a big garden for sure.
While we're still on container gardens, I had a question. Can you do lettuce and radishes in container gardens?
You bet.
Sure. Depth is the key. You can't do it in a flat, but if you've got some depth, you're good.
You can even raise potatoes or most anything in a container. Those people that only have an apartment or something like that still have a wide open agenda there as far as gardening out on their deck if they've got a little sun coming in. That said, you would probably need at least half sun. You wouldn't do well on the north side or maybe the east side, but if you had a place that you had good morning west sun or something like that, you should be able to raise almost any vegetables.
And think about some raised beds too, especially if accessibility is a problem, if your mobility is not so great and leaning over, the ground is further away than it was when you were younger and you just don't want to bend down there. Think about some raised beds, narrow raised beds that you can access from both sides. I've seen them done in long lines. I've seen them done in horseshoes. Don't do them in a big square because you're never going to be able to reach to the middle. But having a nice bed on the ground or raised bed, either one, leaves it a lot more accessible and leaves it to where if you want to do some irrigation, do some soaker hoses and things like that, it makes it really easy to use.
Especially if your landings are easier than your takeoffs.
Yes. And thinking about materials to use for a raised bed, historically you get railroad ties. Well, railroad ties have gotten pretty expensive. I don't know if you've priced them lately, but they are stupid expensive. And I'm not crazy about the idea of the creosote being that close to what I'm eating, I guess. Cedar always seems like a nice option that has some good weathering qualities. I've seen some that do old corrugated barn metal, and then they have some 4x4 cedar posts in the ground. Use that old barn metal to hold up their soil in their bed. There's a lot of different methods.
And redwood's always a great option, but it's a little pricey anymore.
If you're inherently cheap like us, you use what you've got and what you can get a hold of more affordably.
Well, that's when you get a sawmill. And we just happen to have a sawmill on the place, and we cut our lumber when we need it.
But no, he's not offering to cut you all wood for garden beds. No, because he's trying to seed in the greenhouse. Any other questions that we have on flower container gardening and outdoor sort of gardening, Ryan?
Yeah, I had, how do you keep birds from making nests in some like hanging flower pots or something on a porch?
City limits.
Oh. Well,
air pistols. Oh.
9 times out of 10, those people are going to enjoy that.
That's
a
true.
Place for their birds to land, and it's that 10% that's kind of persnickety that way.
I have an orange tree that I pull into the living room in the wintertime, and I pull it out on my porch in the summer. And that's two standbys I almost always have on the porch is my orange tree and a hanging basket of Streptocarpella, which is in that African violet family. And it's a fuzzy leaf and it vines and it's got the little purple trumpets that hummingbirds love. And those are two things you can almost always find on my porch. And every year you can find a bird nest in each of them. And for the most part, they don't harm the plant. They just kind of nestle down in there. As we've seen some try to do some bird netting over their handles on their hanging baskets or bird netting up and over their strawberry beds and things like that. And it's worth a shot. It depends on how determined your bird is, whether or not that'll be effective or not.
Okay. I think the question was, do you use any soil with the peat moss and the sand? Do you mix any of that, or what was the ratio of peat moss and sand again? Can you tell me that?
When you enter in soil, you better be cooking it and getting it completely pasteurized.
Yeah.
And I have cooked it before. That's quite a process in itself, and it's just not worth it for what you can add with a good fertilizer. That's a complete fertilizer with the 20-20-20.
And a lot of commercial greenhouses do have an opportunity to be able to cook their either outdoor soil that comes in or potting media that they want to reuse. And so they have these carts that have a steam pipe on them, and they're able to steam that soil and sterilize it so they can use it from year to year and know that it's sterile to use. If I had my druthers, I would prefer to just have brand new peat and brand new sand in a container pot. But if you're mixing it in with your garden, sure, it's absolutely fine to mix that together with some soil or manure. You just are going to be pulling more weeds depending on what the cows were eating.
All righty. With that, I think we're caught up on questions to this point. So appreciate you taking the time to answer those.
Absolutely. So we'll move on into house plants. I receive a lot of questions about houseplant care here at the flower shop. The two most common ones that I'm asked about are peace lilies and orchids. Those are the two that I am asked about on an almost daily basis. So starting with peace lilies, they are going to bloom whenever they want to bloom. They don't bloom on any set cycle. I always get asked, how often do they bloom? And with peace lilies or with any house plant, it's good to think about fertilizing them every 6 to 8 weeks. The more frequently that you're watering them, the more frequently you're leaching the nutrients through the soil, and the more frequently they're going to need to be fertilized. With peace lilies, of course, when they get thirsty, they drop their leaves. Pothos and philodendron is good about doing that same thing, that they're going to wilt down a little bit and bounce back. We just as soon do a full cycle. We get some that say, well, I water him a little bit every day or a little bit every other day. I want to see that soil saturated from top to bottom, because if that's got good root health, that plant has got roots from top to bottom in its pot. And every time we water, we need to water the entire scope of the roots. And then it's just as important for all of those roots to have access to air. And so we want to do a full pendulum cycle from the soil being fully saturated to fully dry, rather than just keeping the top moist and not ever doing anything for the bottom.
We're getting real close to that time to throw them outdoors. They'll do much better. Then you can go ahead and lay fertilizer to them on a little better basis. Put them in the shade. Don't let the sun get to them. All your houseplants will benefit from outside with shade.
Yeah, definitely with shade. Something that you have to think about is light transmittance. So your light transmittance inside your house is 10% or less what it is outside, even in the winter time. And then as we get towards spring and summer, and the angle that the earth sits towards the sun increases, that percentage even goes up even more as far as how much more light is outside than is inside. And so when we take those house plants inside, make sure they're on the east or the north side of the house or under a patio cover, that they're not going to get any afternoon sun, because it will fry them. And you'll need to keep them under some shade. A lot of those house plants that we have are tropicals, and so they will have been natives of a rainforest floor, filtered light coming through the canopy of the trees, and they're not built to handle that full-on sun that we get here in the summer in Kansas. And speaking of rainforest plants, it would roll me into orchids, which is the other plant that we receive a lot of care of. Almost everybody has picked up an orchid plant when they see it on the clearance rack at the grocery store or at IKEA or at Home Depot, and they go, oh, I can save it. Oh, I can bring it back. And the little cards that they have on those, they'll say, well, just put an ice cube on it, or put 2 ice cubes on it every week or something like that. And what I would ask is, you think about where an orchid comes from. An orchid is an epiphyte. So bulb plants, we've got tulips coming up now. Those are geophytes. Anything that has a bulb is considered a geophyte. Down it comes from the soil. An epiphyte grows naturally hanging on to the tree bark and the branches and the moss that is up in the trees in a rainforest. And so that's why you
Hardly
see,
ever get any ice up there.
well, there is not a little monkey in the rainforest with an ice bucket carrying around a pair of tongs and putting ice cubes on each of the orchids up in the rainforest. That's just not going to be how nature handles that.
That's about the worst fallacy that I've heard of
It's
using
huge.
the ice cubes beside of poison poinsettias.
Yeah.
That's the second worst.
Yeah. No registered death of poinsettias in over 150
Oh,
years with
never.
human or animal, but
Never.
never. Since they've been recording it, though, there's been no recordings. So with orchids, you'll notice that a lot of those come in a pretty pot, and inside of that pretty pot is a clear plastic pot, and you'll notice that some of those roots are green. And the fun fact about that is that orchids are one of the few plants in the world that can photosynthesize through their roots. They actually have chlorophyll in their roots, and that's because the filtered light that they would be getting through the rainforest canopy is such a low level of light that they need every bit of light that they can get. And so they have learned how to photosynthesize not only through their leaves and stems, but also through their roots. And so as far as watering on an orchid, I like to see you soak it in the sink for about 15 minutes once a week, and then have a spritzer bottle of water and spritz the roots, the bark, the leaves, the stems, the flowers, everything every day or two. And that's going to simulate that high humidity environment that they would have had in the rainforest. That's going to let those roots soak up as much moisture as they can, because they are used to, getting a rain in the rainforest at least every week, if not twice a week. And then other than that, let that water drain out of that pot, and then set that pot somewhere that it's going to get light through that clear plastic pot. And that's going to be the best thing that you can do for your orchid
Another
plants.
source of fertilizing those. They can go with a 20-20-20
Sure.
also. You just use about half
Half
rate.
power.
But I can guarantee you that a lot more orchids have been killed by overcare than ever have been cared for.
And that brings me to repotting. I get a lot of people that say, well, my orchid appears to be root bound. It needs to be repotted. And 95% of the time, your orchid does not need to be repotted. They thrive on being in a constricted area. And when you move them to a larger pot, especially if that pot is too
And
big,
throw a bunch of dirt in on them.
oh yeah, throw a bunch of dirt in on them, leave them in a tight little pot with that bark, and that's going to be their happy place. Putting them in a big pot with soil, they're not going to know what to do, and they're not going to do well. And stress, it's interesting how stress can cause performance in plants. I had a customer
The
that,
plant or the grower?
well, yes, but mainly for the plant. The stress a lot of times is what causes those plants to bloom. I had a customer that we'd knew for years, and she had this vining. It was a fuzzy green Jew, a lot like a wandering Jew, only green leaves, and it kind of had a gray fuzz on it. And she would bring it in every year and put it out every spring, and took wonderful care of it. And she came in a few springs ago, and she says, and his name was Charlie the fuzzy green Jew. And she says, Charlie isn't blooming, and I am so upset. And I said, well, how's he look? Well, he's lush, and he's got new growth, and his leaves look great. And I haven't let him wilt once, and I just don't understand why he's not blooming. And I said, I want you to go home, and I want you to stress him out. I want you to let him dry out, not to the point of no return, but let him dry out, stress him out a little bit, and then water him and let him bounce back. And she called me a week and a half later and said, Charlie is blooming again. I said, duh. You had to stress him out, because if a plant thinks that it's got life too good, it's not going to bother blooming, because there's not an urgency to reproduce. And if a plant thinks that it's stressing out a little bit, and there's even a slim chance that it might die, it's more likely to say, I really need to bloom and try to continue my species. And then that blooming effect is going to come into play.
And you really have to be selective of what language you use around
Well, they like you to talk nicely to them, for sure.
them. And music too.
And
if possible.
sing to the, yeah, it's like Mon Pa Kettle, music to milk by. The plants like music to bloom by too, I'm pretty sure. There's an old Baxter Black skit about plants and their feelings. If you haven't looked it up, I would encourage it.
So I think you took care of one question that I had sent to me directly, and that was on like for most of our house plants. So I was immediately thought about like a peace lily. How often should you repot it or put new potting media or in there?
You know, if it's stressed out and it really is truly root bound, it's definitely okay to transplant it, but you don't want a lot bigger pot than what you've got. You usually only want to go up a couple inches. If you're in a 4-inch pot, go to a 6. If you're in a 6, go to an 8. Don't go from an 8 to a 15 because the plant won't know what to do with itself.
And tip that over and take a look at those roots. And if they're not white and bright and healthy, don't bring it to me for repotting because it will be a waste of time and your
Right.
money.
Yeah, you need a bright white root ball on there. And then especially if those roots have been going in circles, take a kitchen knife, take a pocket knife, score those roots several times around the bottom. I a lot of times will even cut the bottom 20% of that root ball off when I transplant it because it's just about as easy for it to regrow that than to mess with that knotted mess that ends up at the bottom of a pot when plants are brought to us for repotting. And as a side note, if you bring us a plant for repotting, bring the pot you want it potted into. We don't keep a lot of pots in stock. And so pick out a pot, bring us the plant and the pot. Do call ahead in case we've got a bunch of weddings. I might put you off a week.
Another question was, how do you transition seedlings, tomatoes, peppers from inside the greenhouse to outside and keep them from getting sunburnt?
Kind of the same way. Put them in the shade outside in a protected place and take care of them that way for a while instead of just going straight to the garden. It's pretty rough on them when you go from in the house to in the garden.
I remember as a kid, we'd have one whole corner of the basement that was full of milk jugs. And if you haven't been saving milk jugs, you might want to call your friends and have them start saving milk jugs for you. But we would cut the bottoms off of milk jugs and you can put those over a tomato plant just right down the row in the garden once you've planted them outside. If there's going to be a frost or something, you can, as long as they're little, put the lid back on and cut the bottom off and poke it down in the soil. It makes a nice little greenhouse to protect them from frost overnight if you got them out in the garden just a little too early.
But that the spindly plants inside is just not plant them early.
Yeah.
Don't plant them so early. And
the cool weather is actually better for the tomato plant because you're going to get a much thicker, stronger base stem that's going to support that tomato plant throughout the growing season, that if you had it in a hot greenhouse or a hot room of your home and it got tall and spindly, it's not getting that base stem developed as strongly as it could.
Well, the old timers, the commercial people always used cold frames.
Mm-hmm.
They put a couple feet of manure in there and that would put enough heat up. And they kept those tomatoes in those cold frames. They'd cover them up. They didn't have to add any additional heat. And those plants were the stockiest plants you will ever find.
Stems bigger than your thumb right away.
On those tomato plants, so yeah, we have transitioned, I guess, from house plants to back to vegetables. I do apologize.
No problem.
Do you need to run like a fan or something on those seedling tomato plants if they're started indoors to get them used to our Kansas winds that they will inevitably experience?
Need that to keep disease out.
And
you can keep diseases in there if it's too moist and holds moisture in that way. So if you can get any air movement at all, it's to your advantage.
Yeah, airflow would help a lot for a lot of different reasons.
Okay. That has taken care. The only question I have left would take us all the way back to the very beginning. And what kind of lights do you use when you go to starting seeds inside? And how high should that light be off the flats?
Okay, I'm going back to K-State when I was in horticulture. Let's go back to the 60s. Well, we had growth chambers everywhere. Didn't have the fancy lights, although they were just coming into the grow lights. Nobody used them at the university. They used half fluorescent and half incandescent, regular bulbs, regular fluorescent bulbs, half of each. And that's pretty much sunlight.
And it does the full spectrum of light
And
that
do
way.
bring it down close to the plant as you can. But you don't need grow lights. You just need a mixture of half incandescent, half fluorescent. And that's what's in my growth chamber in my basement right now for my succulents.
Okay.
And it amazes me how leggy they don't get leggy with that. That really is a nice full spectrum of light for them. If it makes you feel good to spend way too much money on fancy grow lights, go for it. And there's some really interesting studies of different colors of lights and whether or not LEDs are effective. And there are some commercial microgreen facilities and hydroponic lettuce facilities in commercial warehouses across the country now that use a spectrum of red, green, and blue LED lights. But all those different colors and all those different spectrum selections are going for specific responses on specific crops. And so for our garden crops, you're going to be putting them out in the sunlight. You might as well emulate the sunlight as closely as you can.
That said, I'm getting pretty good results with the LEDs in my growth chamber, along with my incandescent and fluorescent.
We did put some LEDs in, didn't we? Yeah.
And you get equal use there.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
The other thing I was going to say about house plants is to make sure that when you place them, especially in the winter, that they're not getting cold gusts of air when somebody opens a door, that they don't have a furnace vent that's blowing directly on them, that they're not touching a window when it's below freezing, because that can cause some plant damage. And as far as watering, if you find brown tips on your peace lily, you are over watering. Let that dude stress out a little bit, cut back on the watering, cut back the frequency, saturate the soil top to bottom when you do water, but don't water nearly as often.
Some of your plants are sensitive to city water.
True.
All you have to do is leave it out overnight or a couple nights and then use it. And you shouldn't have as big a problem with the tips like on your airplane plants and some of the various plants that are quite sensitive to chlorine.
Yeah, the chlorine and things will dissolve out of it if you leave it set for a day or two, just in a watering can out on the bench or something. So we've had a lot of questions on how COVID has affected the horticulture industry and what's going to be available this year and what all has gone on. I'll go back to about a year ago. Right now, we're looking at palm leaves for Palm Sunday and Easter lilies for churches and individuals to use for their Easter services. And this is about where we were a year ago before it felt like the ball dropped. And so it's almost eerie right now for us experiencing kind of what we experienced before life changed. And we were shut down for about 5 weeks at that point. And a lot of things happened in the floral industry during that period of time. The majority of our cut flowers come out of Ecuador and Colombia, some out of California, some out of Indiana, some out of Washington, a lot of different places that those flowers come from. But in Ecuador and Colombia, a lot of those plant growers used that as an opportunity. If they were really wanting to put in some new rose bushes, for instance, they would tear out all their old rose bushes and put in new rose bushes. And at the time that things started to open back up, those roses weren't necessarily in production yet. A few flower growers went out of business entirely. And for several months, they were really only at about 40% capacity of what they had been before the pandemic began. Transportation then became an issue. They were able to get things grown and harvested at those flower farms, but the transportation was a challenge. So when those flowers are cut in Ecuador and Colombia, they get shipped to Miami, Florida, and they go through 2 rounds of inspections. They go through a USDA inspection to make sure there's no foreign soil, no foreign insects, and they also go through a border patrol inspection to make sure that nobody's trying to smuggle anything illegal in between the petals, which I appreciate that. And then they're put on a nice refrigerated truck, brought to Kansas City. And we've got some procurement agents that help to put together what orders we need for weddings and events. They bring them down to us and we process them from there. A lot of flower shops do added chemicals on their flower stems There's Flora Life, and there's those little Chrysol packets that you see fastened to wrap bouquets at the grocery store. The very best place for those packets is in the trash can. They try to emulate the carbohydrates that the flower would get from the plant when it was still attached to the plant, but it's a slightly different sugar structure. And 9 times out of 10, we don't get it dissolved properly in our vase water. It ends up gumming up the flower stem to prevent it from drinking water rather than actually feeding it. So we recommend on cut flowers, just like we do here, trim the stems every other day and put fresh tap water on them. And there's just enough chlorine in the municipal water that it helps reduce the bacteria growth on our cut flowers and helps them to last all that much longer. And we frequently hear from folks that get 2 weeks or better out of our vase arrangements by using that sort of method. We're seeing now on the horticulture supply that as Easter lilies are coming back in this year, they had a lot of trouble getting bulbs in. They maybe only were able to get 50 or 60% of the bulbs that they had ordered. Our primary grower has some pots and baskets that he had ordered a pallet of clear back in June that he still doesn't have. And they've told him that, well, the production facility that's here in the States is shut down, so we've got to get them from Germany. And we don't know if Germany's got them made yet. We know for sure Germany hasn't shipped them yet. And so I'm really interested to see what all the different nurseries and garden centers and greenhouses have available as the shipping and production of those pots and seeds and products has been kind of throttled and limited a little bit.
Although you have a secondary thing, our suppliers, that wholesalers that normally raise a lot of lilies and things, they were scared to put in. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know if they'd have to eat them. Yeah. And so this also is playing into our line now that we could probably use a few more, but they were very conservative.
And I can't blame them really either, because a lot of facilities had their lunch eaten and handed to them basically when all this started. A lot of garden centers did really well, but some of them really struggled. Historically, I would order poinsettias the first or second week of August, because that gives our grower the opportunity to get plugs in and then to transplant those plugs into pots. And then there's a growing season there from August until about Thanksgiving to get those poinsettias ready for us to put on the shelf. And there's one larger grower up in I-70 towards the Legends that has a due date of March 15th this year for poinsettias, because they're having to pre-order their plugs and they're not about to pre-order any more plugs than what they have sold. And it's really challenging on the business side to try to predict demand and predict how many pots that I'm going to need in November and December in March. It was tricky enough in July or August, but this adds an entirely new degree of challenge. And our primary suppliers for tropical plants right now don't have crotons. They don't have parlor palms. They don't have 3 or 4 plants that we're really used to having regularly and very much taking for granted that it was a meat and potato type of plant. And those tropical plants that we grow in the greenhouses here, a lot of those get their start in greenhouses in Florida. The greens industry is huge in Florida, even from the leather leaf and the different ferns and things that I use in flower vases to potted tropical plants. The trouble with those is that they start their small pots from slips. And a slip is a lot like a plug. And some of them are called L pots. There's a lot of different varieties of slips that they would start those cuttings or start them from tissue cultures. The tissue culture, they take a piece of the plant, they have it in a petri dish, and they grow it in a laboratory situation on agar to start that little bit and end up with a full-size plant. I did trial that a little bit with begonias when I was at K-State, and they do really well with it. It's a form of plant cloning.
It's a longer process.
It's a very long process. And so when a lot of those labs and things got shut down during quarantine, there was a time gap. And so we didn't see that problem happen for about 6 months. For 6 months after the pandemic started, supply was perfectly normal. We could get as many of anything as we wanted. And now that they're getting to that point that the plants that we would be getting in 6 and 8 inch pots are the tissue cultures that should have been started a year ago in March or April, that's when we're seeing those supply chain issues start to be a challenge, especially because a good chunk of the horticulture industry finds those tissue cultures to be more cost effective to ship in from China. And so There's been, of course, shipping excitement with China as well, and what we will and won't accept. And so not only is there a problem with the domestic labs here in the States that would have been doing the tissue culture on some of those tropicals, there's also been problem with the supply of the ones that they would get from China. So it's going to be really interesting to see. They're talking about a potential national peace lily shortage. And I'm not a huge peace lily fan, even though they outsell other tropical plants 4 or 5 to 1. But that's something I would have never anticipated as a side effect of a global pandemic, to have a national peace lily shortage.
Yeah, I wouldn't have expected that either. There was a whole lot of this last year I didn't maybe expect, I guess. And
The only thing that we depend on right now is our succulents.
Yeah.
And the reason we can depend on the succulents supplies is that I am growing them, and I have started them and whatnot. So we have a good supply of succulents.
Our propagator kept working during quarantine. It's amazing how that happens.
yeah, that sounds like he was a good businessman and kept growing you something to be able to sell. So
Absolutely, absolutely. We had some other questions come in.
yeah, I had some questions on some violets. They tend to form a ball of leaves in the top of the plant instead of the leaves really just spreading out, and then they usually die later. Any idea what might be going on there?
Put them in a good window that's, find a window that they're happy in. I don't care which one it is, whether it's north or the east, or if you've got a violet window that you've had good luck, that's where you stick your violets. It's kind of a light thing, I think, probably is the biggest part of that.
The other thing that I would mention too is on violets or on cousins of violets like Streptocarpella, they do have a cold water sensitivity. And so if you've got just a little start of a plant, I'm wondering if the little bunch of leaves is, a side shoot off the side of a parent plant. We've tried to pluck that and propagate those. If they're in just a real small area and we're watering them with cold water, it could damage those leaves and prevent them from being able to photosynthesize and get some roots going.
The other thing, don't get water on the leaves, whether it's warm or cold.
Right. They would just as soon keep their leaves dry and their feet moist.
But not too moist.
Not too moist. They like to drink. They don't like to swim.
That's a good way of putting that. I like that one. I'll have to steal that one.
Fail to use like a 20-20-20 Miracle Grow type product on your violets or your houseplants. I would consider maybe a half rate on those.
Just like
but,
your orchids.
But still a steady every month or two to go in with it. And a combination of that with a good light supply and not getting the foliage wet should bring you back to a pretty good quality plant.
All right. One of the other questions I have, do you guys as Turner Flowers and Country Store get anything from Loma Vista?
We don't. Loma Vista is primarily trees and shrubs. They're an outdoor nursery type grower. And they would just as soon work with landscaping companies that are doing some outdoor landscaping, residentially or commercially. And they have some pretty high minimums as far as the number of plants and things that you're going to get. It's about a $2,500 wholesale order before they'll look at you. And I have done some landscaping in the past. He's done some landscaping in the past. I'd just as soon keep it in the past.
I had a chance to work for Lawrence Landscape for a couple of years. And I did use Loma Vista regularly.
Mm-hmm.
They have a good product.
They're a great company.
They're great people.
And they're really good at propagating some less common shrubs and things too. They have some stuff that you can't just find anywhere. But now, if you do need a single tree and you know that Loma Vista's got a variety that you need and they won't sell to you as an individual, give Lawrence Landscape a call and see if they can't get a hold of one for you and get it planted for you.
Loma Vista is a great company, but you better be able to spend $3,000 at a time, or they probably can't afford to deal with you.
But if you've got a big yard, go for it.
No, not wholesale. They won't even sell you that.
But great company, and they're really good community partners. We've had great luck with them donating things for the downtown corners, and they've done work with the young professionals and with the chamber, and they've been really good. Legacy Square, they made some donations for that, and so they've been really good community partners.
And if you've seen their setup, it's an ideal use of the lakes and the waters of the old quarry there. They have a natural setting for it, and they really make good use of it. They're just east of Ottawa.
It would be hard to utilize a large pit like that otherwise, and they do a wonderful job of it.
Something, my master gardeners, we were all going to go and tour Loma Vista. It was going to be last June, and then with the pandemic and everything, of course, we had to kind of back out, but hopefully, here in the near future, we're able to go out and tour it. I've actually never been there, so very exciting to maybe be able to go out and learn about them. So
Good job.
but I am out of questions. If anybody else has a question or something that we would like to ask Sean or Lyle, I would, please put them in the chat or let me know. You guys don't know how much I appreciate you guys spending an hour with us tonight and educating all of us. So I really do hope you know that we appreciate it. And, if you haven't been to Turner Flowers and Country Store, go and buy your significant other some flowers, because I just bought mine for Valentine's Day, and they lasted, I think, for 3 weeks. So they did a really good job.
Stems with keeping them trimmed in fresh water, I bet.
We tried.
Something to remember too is we do $5 Friday flowers, and so it's a wrapped bouquet for $5 that you can take home to brighten up your kitchen now while you're waiting to get your garden up and going before you have your own flowers that you can bring inside and put in a vase. It's a $10 wrap bouquet for $5 on Fridays, and got lots of neat plants and candles and lotions and succulents, lots of succulents. And then if you've got a sweet tooth, we've got the Sweet Shop truffles too that are absolutely delicious. They're a hand-dipped golf ball sized chocolate truffle that pretty much ruin you for any other chocolates.
Yeah. We did have another question come in. When is the best time to plant elephant ears?
After the frost. They're again a tropical.
Very tropical.
But the bigger ones you can get, the better. They'll make the bigger leaves for you. Again, put them in a place where you don't have direct sun. They like to have a little bit of protection. They can handle morning sun. Again, feed them heavy. They're a tropical that likes a lot of fertilizer.
I was visiting with a customer here in just the last couple of days that she was regretting where she had placed her elephant ears last year because she flanked her front porch with them. And the previous year, she had not had her Ring doorbell camera. And she had installed that and then planted her elephant ears. And she saw two things that happened. One, she was missing out on things on her camera because the elephant ears were blocking the camera lens. And two, every time the wind was moving the leaves, it was giving her a notification that someone was at her door. And so think about that. If you've got one of those video doorbells, you might not want to put your elephant ears or your cannas or something that's going to be really tall where they're going to set your camera off. And I see down here on the questions, Spot Artist was asking where our flower shop is located. We're at 231 Main in downtown Ottawa. It's right here, the second building down from the corner of 3rd and Main. If you've been in town for many decades, you might remember this building as the old Monarch Pool Hall.
I'd have to go back 70 years.
That closed in the early 70s. It also was Fashion Alley and Alley Shop when I was a little kid, and it's been a flower shop in this location since the mid-90s.
All right. Well, I am seeing a lot of...
One little tidbit on those elephant ears. I had the pleasure of doing some beds for Baker University a few years ago. There was one large flower bed that I got the biggest bulbs that I could get, and I had elephant ears that was like 4 and 5 feet across. That really did a show.
Wow. 4 or 5 feet across. That's incredible.
Huge. Absolutely huge. Yeah. If y'all have any questions, don't hesitate to come down and see us at the flower shop. Give us a call, shoot us a message on Facebook. All three of us have got access to the business Facebook and Instagram, and so you can message us across there, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. And we'll have some tomato and pepper plants coming, towards Mother's Day probably,
Or a little after.
or a little
Thereabouts.
somewhere in that neighborhood. So we'll have those started in the greenhouse and be ready to put out there in mid to late May. Have them hardened
If
off
they
and ready
don't
to
get
go.
COVID.
Well, as long as, yeah, we'll have to vaccinate our tomato plants and make sure that they're ready to come home with you. But yeah, so be on the watch out for that. We'll hopefully have some hanging baskets and some other plants and things out on the sidewalk too. And so as you're driving through downtown, keep an eye for carts on the sidewalk. Keep an eye on our Facebook and Instagram, because we'll post pictures when those are ready too.
Sounds good. Well, thank you guys once again. I really appreciate it. There was a lot of very useful information tonight. I also want to thank everybody for logging on and joining us this evening. So,
Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. Great job.
well, I appreciate that. And I just, like I said, I just really appreciate the expertise that Lyle and Sean bring. And with that, I will go ahead and stop the recording. We'll end the meeting. So thank you guys very much.